that this is truly, I mean, because we've been basically finishing editing more or less for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it's every time I think we're done, it's one more tweak, and we had to add a subtitle on Thursday, and that means you have to reopen the patient and do all these things that are much more difficult in quarantine than they would be if we had a normal office environment. So this is really the first Monday in at least 2.5 years, and probably way more than that when you think of when we started on this thing, that I haven't been thinking actively about some aspect of how we're going to finish an episode or a scene or the series or whatever. So this is the first Monday of the rest of my life. It's definitely a bizarre feeling.
Well, before we get into the final 2 episodes, and again, Jason will join us one more time to just kind of do an overview, wrap-up type of thing on the entire opus. But have you thought about hanging them up? I mean, really, like, what do you walk away, you're done, you walk away on top of the world, nobody can bring you down, I mean, that's it, move on. Do you even know what else you do with your life?
I would probably go to work for another team and then maybe come back as a player and have... No, I had joked for years about going to, like, Tulum somewhere and just opening a tiki bar and growing a long beard and
yes,
having an assumed name down there and just spending the rest of my days in a Hawaiian shirt with a Mai Tai, getting to know the locals. But I was just telling somebody that it's kind of like your high school or college graduation when for 4 years you're saying, like, I can't wait to get out of this place, and what are you going to do when you leave? And then when that moment hits, you realize, like, this was a chapter of my life that I'll never get back, and it's sad that moment after graduation. I remember cleaning out my dorm. Everyone's parents are there, and they're helping, and it's kind of this frantic rush to get out of there and get in the car and get on the way home, and it's like, wait a second, this is it. Like, we're never going to have this again. So that's kind of the feeling that I have right now, is the feeling that I had when I was driving home from Williams College with my dad, is that, like, okay, there were good times, there were bad times at that place, but I'm never going to have that chapter of my life back again. So it's definitely a mixed bag. Now, I'm also very relieved that we don't have the pressure of this thing anymore. That's to be able to wake up and just get a coffee and put a mask on and go for a walk and walk my dog and just kind of be chilled out for a second is great. But it's going to take, I kind of worry about the next thing because it's going to take something, really a powerful story, a story that I've wanted to tell for a long time for it to even come close to matching this.
Have you thought about just taking some time off, going out west and playing golf with your friends?
I would love to do that. Yeah. I would love to do that. Maybe I'll spend whatever money is in my final check on getting, like, a beat-up RV, come out there, and if you give me a few strokes, I can try and smoke you.
Well, we know a guy who knows a lot about RVs, don't we, Dave?
Wow, yeah. Spent that whole month on the RV. Don't do it. Just don't ruin RVs for yourself, Jason. We'll get to that, too, at some point.
I mean, what I'm trying to do, actually, I know my parents are listening. What I really want to do, like, my finish line, my Zawataneo moment,
nice,
will be golfing with my dad. If I can get back up to Boston and play around the golf with my dad, I don't care if I don't come within 8 feet of him, and to see my mom and to somehow hug her from across the room or something, that's the finish line for me, because all these things are going on. It's all exciting and fun, and it's a great distraction for me. I probably had the easiest quarantine of anyone in the country because I'm healthy and because I was busy every day. And I probably would have been doing the exact same thing in quarantine that I would have been doing if life was normal. It was just sitting at a computer and finishing this thing. But it's just like everybody else. You just want to see your family and have life be the way it was.
We'll play golf with your dad. It'd be cool if you were there, but I don't really...
You can FaceTime me. He'd probably rather play with you. I think you might be his favorite son he never had.
Jason,
anywhere west of the Mississippi, you are his favorite human being.
I'm the guy. Jason joins us. I'd like to, one of the things I like to do is take advantage of our friendship and ask you things that I would hope, I think at this point you've been asked everything and go in different places. But in this case, the question I'm sure you've been hit up with so many times. Bob Iger comes to you, whomever, pick the person, lays out just a lump of cash, says, Jason, you got carte blanche. Do you have a project in mind that's now your next white whale? Is there something you'd like to tackle more than anything? And I'm curious, is it something as big as, Tiger Woods? Or is it something more niche and smaller? Where do you think is there something in your brain for your next step if you had carte blanche on everything?
Yeah, there's definitely a few things. I love you to death, but I can't talk about them here or else I'd ruin those things.
Okay.
But
is it a breakdown? Is it a breakdown of He-Man and what happened late in the 80s and his fall from grace? Because it just don't say anything. If
He-Man, like the He-Man Skeletor He-Man?
Yes.
I was never really into those.
Wow. Okay.
I don't think that I would be. I think the Muppet Babies doc has been done. I was a big Muppet Babies fan back in the day. Maybe delving into Papa Smurf's. Into the skeletons in his closet. No, I don't know, man. I don't know what in sports, especially with a known figure. It's one thing to do like, a small story about an anonymous, like a high school team or something like that could be cool. But I don't know what story about a known sports figure could touch this right now.
Right.
And the thing is, too, that I get bored very quickly. So I had said for months, like, I can't wait. I'm going to take a couple of months off and whatever. And then on, I think it was Thursday we delivered the final episode. Friday I was doing interviews like this. And Saturday I had like 3 hours to take a nap. And I woke up and was like, all right, what are we doing? It's just kind of like antsy, especially in these conditions. Everyone's just sitting inside. You want to go outside. You want to get something done. So, I am working on a couple of things, but I'm not at liberty to say those right now.
Okay. All right. Jason Hehir joining us. I pulled the curtain back a tiny bit, and I hope I'm not in trouble for this in our last segment when we were reviewing the final 2 episodes. I wasn't the only one, I'm sure, but, man, did I send you probably 30 songs? And you went with a Pearl Jam deep cut at the end there. And my own offense taken aside that you didn't see my vision, what landed you? The soundtrack to this thing has been really, I would think, an unexpected obsession by a lot of people. They really latched onto it, and in all seriousness, such a phenomenal job. And you end the whole thing with old Eddie Vedder in a cut that a lot of people haven't heard. What was the process there? And by the way, well done. But what landed you on that?
That song, I've loved that song forever. I remember the first time I heard that song was in '96 when I was in Ireland. And there were a bunch of us sitting around. I was on a study abroad program. There was a bunch of us sitting around in someone's dorm room, and that album had just come out. So someone played that. I remember loving that song then, and I've just had it, kind of. It's made it through playlists and stuff for the last 24 years in my kind of rotation. And then at the beginning of this project, that was the song that I wanted to use for the end of this. So we were going to. There was a time when we were calling each episode something that had been said in the show, whether it be like a blatant line in the show or like an Easter egg of like a sign that was in the show or like words that were used in the show somehow. So like episode 2 was My Day Will Come, because that's what Scotty says at the press conference at the beginning of episode 2 in the cold open when they're asking him about how underpaid he is. So that was the name of that episode. And then I think episode 1 was like the beginning of the end because someone said that. And the reason I wanted to do that is because episode 10 was going to be present tense. I loved that song. I loved the ebb and flow of it. It makes for a really good kind of victorious, triumphant end of an era or end of a project kind of song, because it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, and then like falls off a cliff, and you can just kind of ease into the credits. So the structure of it worked perfectly. And then when we started to find this footage, first of all, then reading every Bowles and Jordan book and all the kind of the Zen mindfulness stuff that Phil was teaching, of not to look forward or back, And then to find out that Michael had that philosophy basically his whole life, and I think that's why Phil's teachings resonated with him so much and why he was so willing to participate in those meditation sessions and yoga and all that, which actually made the rest of the team buy in too, because Phil was saying it, Michael was doing it. It just had, it resonated so much with me that these guys live in the moment. And that then the cold open to episode 10 was Michael 6 hours before tip-off of his finals ever. And he's acting like it's a preseason game. The guy could not care less about what's about to happen or what happened in the past. He's just living in the moment and enjoying it and touching nothing but the bottom of the net when they're having that half-court shooting contest. So all signs were pointing to that. And we auditioned some other songs for it, and I wanted to be sure that this was the right one. And, we have a lot of partners, and people have a lot of musical tastes, and I didn't know that people would agree with the song, because it is kind of an obscure song. It's not like we're using a live or even flow or something from them. And also, it didn't hurt for the people who get the wink that Eddie Vedder is a massive Chicago sports fan and was actually present that season a lot. He's the guy who kind of chaperoned Dennis Rodman. And our schedules didn't work out. I had reached out to Vedder several times to be part of the doc, because the story that I heard is that Phil pulled him aside and said, okay, Dennis can go on these vacations, but I need you to kind of chaperone him and keep him out of trouble. So he's in some of the footage, not in Vegas, but he came to the facility one time, and he doesn't have much of a jumper, but he was at the practice facility with them and just kind of messing around with the ball and talking to the players. He was at one of the games. So there were just a lot of boxes being checked that pointed towards that song being used.
Jason Hehir, director of The Last Dance, joining us. Going into this, 10-part doc, like everybody else, I had the things I wanted to see. One thing I didn't know that I needed so much in my life was the interaction between Michael and Scott Burrell throughout this entire 10-part docuseries. As you were going through that footage and putting this whole thing together, at what point did you realize, this sort of relationship they have is kind of a very important story to tell when it comes to telling the story of how Michael was, on the practice court as a leader as such?
Immediately, because that's the first person that Michael mentioned to me when we first met in September of 2017. Now, I knew who Scotty was before that, obviously. Just first of all, from being a sports fan, especially in New England in the 90s, I knew Scott Burrell, who also was a legitimate major league prospect as a pitcher. I think he threw in the upper 90s. And also, so I knew about him from a research phase, but when I met Michael and asked him, why do you want to do this? And he said, I don't. And I said, why not? And he said, because when people see this footage, they're not going to understand it. And he said, there's a guy named Scott Burrell. I made that guy's life a living hell for the entire season. I MF'd him up and down the floor, and he was saying that, but I remember him saying to me, but I had to do that because I needed to know that I could count on him when we were playing the Indianas and the New Yorks and the Miamis in the Eastern Conference. I needed to know that I had him coming off the bench and he was going to be tough enough, so I had to toughen him up. But people won't understand that that's the way I was treating him. And that's when we had this great conversation of, okay, we have 10 hours to give the context of this, and we'll be able to sit down and have you voice what you just voiced, and I'll be able to talk to Scotty and get his. We're going to tell a comprehensive story from all these angles. It's not just going to be an out-of-context B-roll of you, yelling at him in practice or faking an elbow to his face, and then people think that you're a jerk. It's not going to be like that. We're going to explain to people why you were doing what you did. So I was aware of that relationship, and also they're very close to this day. Michael told me I love Scotty Burrell. They golf together every summer. Michael hosts him down in Florida every summer. Scotty Burrell, you will not meet a nicer person than Scott Burrell. And Michael knows that, too. He's the one who said, I've tried to get him to fight me, but he's just such a nice guy, he couldn't do it. So I think it became kind of a game for Michael, because the irony is that Scotty's very tough to be able to take that stuff. Michael is still giving him crap the night before Game 5, or the hour before Game 5 of the finals in '98. You see, if I ever see you again, I'm gonna whip your ass. That's kind of like locker room banter between two guys who are friends with each other and know they're going to be friends after this. Because Scotty's giving it right back to him. He doesn't have quite the trash talking skill that Michael has, but he's not sitting there and he's not some withering flower in the corner. He's giving it right back to him. So I don't want people to think that we were mocking Scotty at all, or like poor Scotty Burrell, because he's doing great now. He's a really, really great guy, and he and Michael are still very close.
As we wind down with Jason Hehir, director of The Last Dance, and we'll have an opportunity in an extended form to go over a lot of your decisions. You know I'm always obsessed with the art and your thought process, so I'll just ask you something from last night. I was really enthralled with where you went with Steve Kerr. First off, we've talked before about the cojones it takes to give notes back to Michael Jordan or to ask a person this or that question, but to be in a room with Steve Kerr and then with his mother and to bring up the most horrific parts of their lives face to face. You established right away when Steve said, and I'm paraphrasing, that they had never spoke about their shared tragedies with their fathers, yet you still proceeded to go there with Steve and his mom. And I was, for a second, going, well, why is Jason going here if it's not really germane necessarily, since they never spoke of it? My guess is, and I'm always curious to see how near I am, you made the artistic decision to go there with both of them. Was that your way of kind of, for lack of a better term, winking at the fact that even though they didn't speak on it, between the practice fight, that really established kind of an unspoken both on and off court bond between the two? Yeah,
it's not a wink. That's the truth.
Okay.
They both knew of what happened with each other's father. I mean, we, like so many of the stories in this thing, we could have done an entire episode on that and on the unspoken bond between Michael and Steve. Because I don't know when Michael found out exactly what happened to Steve's dad, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was after the punch incident, because that punch happened right at the beginning of the 95-96 season. Might have been in training camp. So he couldn't have known Steve for that long. But, you know, it's almost more poignant that they never spoke about it, but that they knew about it. And to this day, I mean, just what's crazy to picture is that Steve saw that for the first time last night. And
wow.
Steve's never seen that before. He'd never seen that episode before. We provided that. I think ESPN gave him like the first 8 cuts, but no one had seen 9 and 10. There's maybe, you know, 15 people in the world had seen 9 and 10, and Steve was not one of them. So he was seeing that for the first time last night, and I can't imagine what's going through their head when they see the deep dives on each of these guys' dads, the respect and the bond that must be there underneath. I mean, luckily, I have absolutely no, you know, I can't put myself in that position because I haven't been through anything like that. But yeah, it was just it was too good a story to tell, and I think it speaks volumes. I have such respect for Steve Kerr, such respect and admiration for him, for what a coach he is, what a player he was, and what a person he is. And what a man he is. I asked him, we finished that interview, which was one of the best interviews we had in the entire process, and I shook his hand and just asked him to run for president and told him good luck with the rest of the season. But he's the kind of guy, I mean, that's a leader right there. And, you know, it's really difficult to bring these things up with people, and I always, you know, thank them profusely afterwards, because not only are you bringing it up to these people who you wouldn't want to do this to someone with no cameras around, even if they were your friend, it's difficult to talk about. When there's cameras there, and then you're asking them about it, they get emotional, your first response as a human being is to hug the person and interrupt their tears and say, hey, Kate, do whatever you need to do. But in order to convey to the audience how painful it is for them, in order for the audience to empathize with them, you have to just sit back and not say anything. And those are excruciating moments, especially when you respect the person as much as I respected Steve, and you know, to even bring it up with his mother, who was just this angelic woman. I have such respect for her as well. That's why a lot of those times I don't even say the word, the incident, the murder, the anything. I'll just say, tell me about that day in 1984, and they know what I'm talking about. So I can say to Michael, take me back to July of 1993, and he knows what I'm talking about. So those are really delicate kind of minefields, emotional minefields to navigate, but I really wanted people to know that when Michael punched Steve Kerr, he didn't punch the smallest guy on the team. He punched the toughest guy in the franchise.
Well, that leads perfectly into my final question. people watching the documentary might not notice or might forget, because that's your job to get them to forget that there's a voice asking questions off screen, and that's your voice, and we hear it from time to time. I'm in there with you as a viewer when you're talking to Steve, and Steve starts talking about it, and you can see him start to break. Dead air in any form of media is the toughest thing in the world. It takes the most discipline, as you just went into, allowing announcers, letting the moment breathe, anything, letting the interview subject continue. And it's so hard. It takes such discipline to allow that silence, to allow them to dangle like that so that you can see that raw emotion. And you did that with Steve. You did that with his mother, I'm sure. My last question, Jason, is, are you even in an emotional place in those situations where you could even answer if I said which was tougher, speaking to Steve's mother or speaking to Steve? Or do you somehow have to find a way to turn your emotions off during those types of interviews?
You certainly do in both. You certainly are in an emotional place in both. Just as a human being, you'd be a monster if you weren't. It was more difficult to speak to, and not that I don't have extreme sympathy for Steve, but we were in a hotel room. He was coming from a shoot-around. He's still in his Warriors gear. There's just kind of a bunch of guys there. We did that interview in New York, so there were local people there, and it's just kind of a more professional setup. With Steve's mom, we went to this house that was like, it's the most heavenly house that I've ever been to in my life. It's this beautiful house that hangs over a cliff on the Pacific Ocean in the Palisades in California. And it's where Steve grew up. The hoop is still in the driveway, and the bassinet where Steve was a baby is still in the living room. And I think that was his grandfather's or his great-grandfather's. It's just this house is like a museum. Steve's drawings are on the wall. And it's so telling when you go to these people's homes and there's one famous child and the other children aren't famous, and there's just as many photos of everybody else and everybody else's grandkids. It's no one is more special than the other one, and I love seeing that. And that was the same with Steve and his siblings. And his dad's office is kind of the way that it was, with those pictures hanging up. You saw the pictures that we showed on that wooden wall, the black and white photos of him. That's his actual office in the home. So to go into a place like that where you feel like you're a guest. In the hotel, it was different. We're kind of in a neutral territory, and it's very difficult to talk about. Don't get me wrong. You know this from doing the same thing. But when you're in someone's home, and there's just something about taking your shoes off in someone's home and walking around in your socks, you just feel like you've been welcomed into this place. So then to sit there and ask them to recount the worst moment of their life, that hits in a different way emotionally. And I have such gratitude and respect for people who are willing to go there, because they don't know us. I'll probably never see Steve's mom again. And it almost feels inappropriate to ask some of these questions because these are really, really personal details. But I think it's so important when we're doing these things. We're trying to tell human stories, and we're trying to, on a very basic level, art is meant to connect all of us. And share that humanity. So we have to tell these stories to get people to realize that Steve Kerr is just like you or me, who would mourn his dad or his mom or anybody else. So it's difficult things to do, but among the most gratifying things to do is when we can tell a story like that and pull it off. I think the way that we did, it's one of my favorite, 8-minute stretches of the entire doc.
Jason, I love you. I am so proud of you. You're like a brother to me. You know this, and you're a better person than you are a filmmaker, and that's saying something because you knocked this thing out of the park. Your parents did well. I know they're listening right now. Hello, Joe. Hello, Mary. And I think anyone that knows you is bursting with pride, and so many that don't. I follow social media. I see people interacting with you, and I'm on top of the world. And part of the proof of that is Jason has taken time each and every week when he is getting hit up by markets and personalities and places far, far, far bigger than us here in Sacramento, of which Jason has a special affection for the city, and we'll get into that in our next conversation. But, dude, just absolutely kick-ass job, and we appreciate you giving us this time each and every week.
Always, man. Thanks for having me.